Hello, everybody. My name's Maria Lee, and I'm co-convener and co-editor of UCL's Current Legal Problems lecture series and publication. And the Faculty of Law here at UCL has been hosting these lectures since 1948. It's a real privilege to share this role, and it's also a privilege to welcome Dr. Anna Chadwick as our lecturer today. My job today is just to welcome you to UCL Faculty of Laws and also to welcome people joining us online or for the recording afterwards. I'm really delighted that Anna's our lecturer today. I'm very excited to hear about her work on just prices. And I'm also delighted to be able to introduce our chair, Dr. Agnieszka Smoleńska. She is Senior Policy Fellow at the Centre for Economic Transition Expertise at the Grantham Research Institute. And she's leading their work on transition planning in the financial sector. So thank you very much for joining us, Agnieszka, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and it's such a pleasure and a privilege to introduce Dr. Anna Chadwick, who will deliver today's Current Problems lecture, outlining her vision for a legal theory of prices. Dr. Anna Chadwick is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Glasgow, a university she has been affiliated with since 2017. Prior to that, she was Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, where we had the opportunity to cross paths. Dr. Chadwick is a recipient of several prizes, such as in 2023, the Philip Leverhulme Prize that recognizes and celebrates the achievements of outstanding researchers whose work has already attracted international recognition. Anna's impressive academic journey makes her particularly well equipped to grapple with the question of the role of law in price formation. In her PhD, defended in 2015 at the LSE, Dr. Chadwick explored the role of law in structuring financial transactions and food commodity derivatives, with the implications this brings for food availability and in extreme cases, hunger. This combination of perspectives from two worlds, the world of complex financial transaction structuring and the world of pressing social issues, already tells you so much about Dr. Chadwick's approach, venturing into what can only be described as hostile territory for scholars interested in justice and equity, a task as difficult as it is necessary. Her work since has explored themes at the intersection of law and economics, the role of law in contemporary political economy, monetary system implications for constitutionalism. Introducing Anna would be incomplete without mentioning her enormous contribution to building up a vibrant community of legal scholars engaging with political economy questions in Europe, a project which she co-leads with Ioannis Kampourakis, who's here with us today. The Law and Political Economy in Europe project. The generosity towards early stage scholars, elevation of new ideas, and a passion for a contribution that law can make in refining our understanding of topics monopolized by economics, while maintaining a sensitivity to social outcomes, is something that shines through Anna's research and scholarly work, as you are about to hear. Anna, over to you.
Okay, so good afternoon. It's very nice to be here. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Maria Lee and Christina Giannakopoulou for their work organizing this lecture. And also Agnieszka, of course, for kindly agreeing to be my chair. I'd also like to thank the Leverhulme Trust for providing me with the funding to initiate a new project on the topic I'm going to talk to you about today. So the aim of the lecture is to explore the basis for a bold claim, which is that it is not only possible, but also timely and necessary to develop a legal theory of prices. This is a bold claim indeed, since it implies that there is a need for a sea change in disciplinary competences, pursuant to which law and not economics might become the dominant discipline for explaining how prices are formed in the political economy, and even for modeling how they behave. The first thing that I'll do in the lecture is explain why I think it is time for a radical change in how the theorization of prices is approached. I do want to underline that I'm not seeking to present a fully worked out theory of legal theory of price today. That work will be done in collaboration with other legal academics and political economists who are interested in the generative and economic power shaping qualities of legal regimes. So the second thing I will do in the lecture today is to offer a mapping of how other disciplines that have offered theories of price or that have engaged with price theory think about the role of law specifically in price formation. What emerges from this is a significant finding, which is that the theories of price that are considered to be the most theoretically rigorous tend to push law into the background of the analysis. For very different reasons, neoclassical economics, widely acknowledged to be the dominant theory of price and value today, and Marxist economics, widely recognized to be the most systematic alternative to neoclassical price theory, downplay the role of the state and legal architecture in price formation. This is a marked contrast with the disciplines of institutionalist economics and economic sociology. Whilst exhibiting significant differences in focus and approach, both of those disciplines regard institutions as being essential for any market price to emerge. Legal academics have already built on these insights to advance striking claims about the importance of legal institutions specifically to processes of price formation. As Robert Hockett and Roy Kreitner, two leading critical scholars working in the US context, have underlined in an influential article on the medieval doctrine of the just price, changing background rules makes all the difference in pricing many of the most important market interactions. It's hard to imagine pricing pharmaceuticals without patent law, impossible to make sense of real estate prices without local zoning ordinances, incoherent to consider the price of medical care without insurance law, at least in the US context. Also highlighting the pervasive role of government in actively setting many important prices in the economy, their conclusion is that prices are legally engineered. Joaquin Reyes-Barros, a former PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, has produced an exceptional thesis on the just price, and he reaches a similar conclusion. In effect, markets operate through law. There is not a single economic institution that is not also a legal institution. Prices are no exception to this. If this is true, then the relationship between wealth inequality and market prices is the product of a regrettably pervasive but by no means inevitable design. This begs the question, if we can understand the legal engineering of prices, does this mean we can develop a legal theory of price? And does it give us any inroads into making the prices that seem to inhere in the objects around us and to direct behavior in the political economy in which we are immersed any more just? I'll come back to discuss the contributions of those scholars in the latter part of the lecture, in which I will argue that using a law and political economy approach, it is possible to develop a legal theory of price that has explanatory purchase. So, why time for a legal theory of price? In the context of the period of inflation post the coronavirus epidemic, rising energy prices, inaccessible house prices, etc., there's a growing consensus that economists are not adequately able to explain how prices are behaving in markets. As Peter Coy writes in the New York Times in 2024, we were surprised when inflation rose, we were surprised when inflation fell, and we were surprised again when inflation stopped falling. The message of all of these surprises is that we, including professional economists, don't really have a strong grasp on why prices go up and down. This is a somewhat damning indictment of a profession that claims to have something of a monopoly on theorizing prices. What is more, in spite of the failure to offer convincing accounts of price inflation, economists are far from reticent in reacting unfavorably to certain proposals like rent caps, energy price caps, and initiatives like basic income that are often categorized as market distortions that will have damaging knock-on effects. These are just a few recent examples of the cost of living crisis in high-income economies. However, critiques of economic theory and its conception of prices and the world-shaping impacts of those theories goes a lot further. Less than a decade ago, it was claimed that economists had caused the global financial crisis, as their claims to be able to accurately price and model financial risk led to the creation of a series of contractual instruments, mortgage-backed securities and derivatives, that effectively distributed risks associated with poorly collateralized loans around the financial system. Since the 1980s, populations in the global South experienced an earlier wave of legal and policy reform, grounded in economic theory focused on getting the prices right, that proposed that by liberalizing, privatizing, and deregulating economies, they would experience welfare-enhancing growth. Many countries in the South during this period had price controls, trade subsidies, and foreign exchange rate regulations in place, and getting the prices right in this context meant removing those distortions to enable prices to reflect true supply and demand conditions. But far from improving inequality, as Jason Hickel, a globally influential scholar working on inequality, has uncovered, policies of structural adjustment implemented by international economic institutions turned out to be, quote, the greatest single cause of poverty in the 20th century after colonialism. This is perhaps not all that surprising, given that getting the prices right, according to dominant neoclassical economic theory, often requires preventing governments from interfering with the informationally and allocatively efficient price mechanism. As Reyes-Barros underlines in his thesis, the allocation that so-called efficient market prices effectuate is one that is often structurally reinforcing economic inequality. The supply and demand theory of price assumes that buyers and sellers in a market purchase and sell goods and services based on their reservation price, the maximum price that a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service, or the minimum price that a seller is willing to accept. Reyes-Barros points out that it is not only the preferences of market actors that shape their trading behavior, their prices are materially constrained by their financial circumstances. If background wealth has an impact on reservation prices, then the price system works in such a way that those who have more background wealth, the rich in short, are at liberty to impose their willed prices on those that have less, without the poor being able to do much about it. It is an aggregation of these prices, the prices imposed on the poor by the rich, that constitutes the market price for a given commodity. In addition, then, to the explanatory failings and normative poverty of the core apparatus of economic theorizing on price formation, the fact that law in many of these examples is a handmaiden, seeking to give institutional and social life to economic models that have had damaging social effects, would suggest that there is a need for more scholars to enter into debates about pricing. So let's now turn to look more closely at dominant accounts of price and how they position the role of law and the state. The two most developed and systematic theories of value and price in economics or political economy are issued by two radically opposed schools of thought that for very different reasons tend to place the role of the state in the background of the analysis. These theories belong to the tradition of neoclassical economics and to Karl Marx. Both of these theories are preoccupied with understanding the economic laws of motion of the political economy, and they consider prices to move in dialogue, though not always in agreement, with those laws of motion. Neoclassical economists and Marxist economic theory are considered to be more rigorous and all-encompassing than the theories that came before them in classical political economy, and the institutionalist theories that came later, because they purport to develop a coherent account of what value is, that is attentive to the qualitative element of price theory, i.e. what it is prices are measuring, as well as the quantitative element as to why the prices of different goods exhibit the particular ratios they exhibit with regard to one another over time. For example, why a cup of coffee in the UK now costs around £4, when a few years ago it cost just over £3, and why coffee is a more expensive beverage than milk. Classical political economy also tried to answer these questions, and in common with Marx, regarded the source of value as labor. However, Marx is considered to have transcended some of the problems and inconsistencies that arose in that earlier tradition, notably the question of where profits come from. Marx put forward a formalized theoretical system that explains how the surplus labor extracted from workers in different industries nonetheless results in an equal rate of profit across economic sectors. Neoclassical economics has also created a formalized theoretical system to solve the qualitative question of what value is and the quantitative question of how different prices relate in ratios to one another at a given point in time. In contrast to Marx, however, who sought to denaturalize the foundations of the categories out of which classical political economists like Smith and Ricardo had constructed their theories by specifying that the laws of motion of capitalism are grounded in historically specific social relations of production, neoclassical economics achieved its formalized theoretical system by focusing entirely on the realm of exchange and by ignoring social relations of production. As Gunnar Myrdal has highlighted, confining the variables to only a few that can be quantified permits the use of impressive mathematical models which regularly presuppose a sharp restriction in vision. Almost the entire social system is kept out of sight. There has, of course, been a lot of theoretical development of both of these theories of value and price. Nevertheless, both theories continue to regard prices as responding to and being driven by economic laws, underlying laws of value. As André Orléans has highlighted in his important book, Empire of Value, both neoclassical economists and Marxists are united in positing that value is a substance that inheres in the things that are traded in markets as commodities. But the two approaches regard the source of that value very differently. Marx followed Smith in underlying that the prices for which things are traded in exchange, their money prices, do not always reflect their use values, but he insisted that the law of value means that money prices will gravitate around their true prices, prices of production, reflecting the labor that went into them. But crucially, those production prices include both surplus value extracted from labor and reflect conditions of capitalist competition and average rates of profit across different industries. Value on this account is objective. Its substance is labor, but more specifically, it is labor power that is sold as a commodity in historically specific social relations. Engels, Marx's long-term collaborator, eulogized Marx as follows. Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, Marx discovered the law of development of human history. The law of value for Marx is the infinite circuit in capitalism by which money becomes more money by means of the production of commodities, by virtue of the extraction of labor power under capitalist property relations. The origins then of what came to be referred to as the neoclassical school of thought can be traced to the writings of so-called marginalist economists, Stanley Jevons, Carl Menger, and Leon Walras in the latter part of the 19th century. We should not forget that the rise of neoclassical economics was provoked by political realities. Classical political economy and its labor theory of value were fundamental tools for the progressive development of socialist ideas, pursuant to which prices should reflect their true values, the value of the labor that went into them. This was a context in which the socialist movement contested the justice and right to exist of forms of income other than wages. The move away from the labor theory of value by Jevons, Menger, and Walras shifted the focus away from production and focused on the realm of exchange, as I have mentioned. These economists argued that the source of value is utility, the usefulness of the things traded. The starting point is the individual, and more accurately, the individual as a consumer and their subjective preferences. Importantly, for neoclassical economists, there is still a unique law governing the movement of prices, but it is the economic laws of supply and demand that act to control the gravitational direction of prices. Pursuant to this conception of how markets work, when competitive conditions are right, there are no price makers who can set prices, only price takers. By virtue of the shift of marginalism to the realm of exchange, profits, interest, and rent are not explicitly justified according to their place in a system of rights based on natural law, as animated the thinking of Adam Smith and other classical political economists. Rather, profits, interest, and rent, as well as wages, are remunerated at their correct values, according to their utility as measured through competitive and efficient market exchange. There is no need to talk about natural law or law at all. So before we move on, it's important to reflect briefly on how these different perspectives see the function of prices and how they understand the role of law and the state. For Marxists, money prices function to coordinate exchange to an extent, but they also function to obscure the social relations of exploitation that are the engine of capitalism. For Marx, there are no reasonable or just prices, as all of them represent the fragile contract that avoids the direct use of violence. And I'll come back to that idea in the conclusions. For neoclassical economists, prices function to coordinate production and exchange, and under particular conditions, notably those of competition, function to allocate resources to their best available uses, to those who value them most highly. Prices on this account are already just because they are the true measure of value, understood as utility of the things produced for trade in the market. With regard to the role of law, in more simplistic Marxist accounts, law and the state are part of the superstructure that arises on the historically specific social relations of production of capitalism. And critically, these institutions are not neutral, but were made by capitalists for capitalists. Much contemporary Marxist scholarship seriously complicates that view. Nevertheless, it is maintained that it is the law of value that shapes the behavior of social agents, including the state and law. In cruder expositions of neoclassical economics, the state is an actor that merely meddles in pre-constituted markets through regulations. The property rights and the structures that enable markets to exist are pervasively naturalized or not discussed. In more sophisticated discussions of neoclassical economics, or at least in the discussions of theorists who have a similar conception and use mathematical formulas to think about pricing, the role of law and legislation in creating the infrastructure of the market is acknowledged, but it is argued that market activity should be coordinated through a decentralized price mechanism, as this is the best model we can have if we want a free and democratic society. Friedrich Hayek was an Austrian economist, and there were important divergences with neoclassical thought, but nonetheless, his ideas about the role of competition as a discovery procedure and the informational efficiency of prices has been one of the intellectual cornerstones that has justified policy approaches that present government interventions into markets as distortions of a superior system of social provisioning. Hayek acknowledges the legal foundations for that system, but he nonetheless sees certain types of government intervention and centralized government planning as a distortion. So now let's turn to consider the arguments of other disciplines that have studied price and challenged the influential neoclassical account. One of the disciplines that has perhaps most strenuously challenged neoclassical economics in recent years is the field of economic sociology. This field stresses the role of networks, relations of trust, culture, and technologies in enabling market transactions to take place and in orienting social actors towards calculating economizing behaviors. One way of thinking about the contributions of economic sociology here would be as bringing back in the social world that the mathematical formula of economists have abstracted from. As Eloi and Fines have underlined, unlike economists, socialists do not seek to build a single price-setting model. Rather, they start from specific empirical fields in order to draw up contextualized analytical models that take into account the specificities of the goods exchanged and the concrete practices of social actors. Significantly, economic sociologists have also stressed the powerful work that technologies and mathematical formula do in producing prices by enabling humans to calculate, and indeed by conditioning them to calculate in particular ways. One of the leading scholars in this area of economic sociology, Michel Collin, has articulated the challenge that this approach presents to neoclassical economics as follows. Tell me how your price was composed and of what, and I will tell you whether I accept it, not tell me whether or not it was formed at the end of a well-organized competitive process. Economic sociology has produced fascinating insights into how prices are produced and negotiated by social actors, and has essentially exploded the neoclassical conception of price formation, demonstrating repeatedly in myriad contexts that prices are not formed and do not function according to its prescripts, even the more qualified versions of neoclassical theory that would anticipate imperfect competition, etc. Nevertheless, there are some key limitations of this field in terms of building an alternative account of price formation. First, much of the work is focused on the micro level and is so empirically dense and specific that it's hard to draw broader conclusions about price formation in the political economy. And also, as Beckett underlines, there is a general reluctance in the field of new economic sociology, at least, with the exception of historical studies, to study the role of the state in regulating the economy. The work of Jens Beckett is a notable example to this anti-institutional trend and could be discussed in its own right, but he basically arrives at a similar place to the legal scholars mentioned earlier in the lecture, suggesting that it is impossible to make sense of market prices without looking closely at the interactions between various legal regimes. So, to summarize the perspectives that we have encountered so far, these three schools of thought all tend to place state and law in the background of the analysis and to place emphasis elsewhere, developing alternative concepts through which to understand markets and price formation. We'll now take a look at the work of institutionalist economists who have further advanced theorizing on the critical importance of legal institutions to the formation of prices. Institutionalist economics is a diverse tradition encompassing works by scholars writing over a period of almost 150 years. Nevertheless, it's united as a field by a focus on how institutions, social structures, and historical context shape economic behavior. In contrast to the neoclassical focus on exchange, old institutionalist economists, a body of thinkers predominantly writing in the US during the first decades of the 20th century, thought to theorize the economy as a social provisioning process, taking into consideration, as did the classical political economists, the fields of production and distribution, as well as exchange. Milanakis and Fine emphasize the diversity of institutionalist economics, noting that there is no clearly defined body of principles on which institutionalists are generally agreed, but observing that if there is anything all institutionalists have in common, it is dissatisfaction with orthodox price theory. He's talking here about old institutionalist economists. Yet one of the most important lacunae in institutionalist thought is exactly the absence of a price theory or a value theory. Nevertheless, the contributions of two figures who are considered as the giants of old institutionalist economists are significant in terms of their thinking about how they re-theorize the market and how this leads to a re-theorization of price. And these are Thorstein Veblen and John R. Commons. Taking Veblen first, Veblen argued that it was not the preferences of asocial individuals that informed economic activity, but the habits of thought that direct the behavior of social actors. These habits of thought are, for Veblen, institutions. In a book published in 1921 called The Engineers and the Price System, Veblen argued that the price system is not decentralized and democratic, but is controlled by financial elites. He argued that a class of engineers could take control of industrialized production and organize the economy rationally to produce efficiency and welfare. In Veblen, then, we see the idea of a price system as an engineering project. Veblen regarded the state as the enforcer of a price system dominated by business interests, but he was skeptical about the potential of legal reform as a means to improve the price system, and his analysis didn't focus a great deal on law. Nevertheless, Veblen, who took an evolutionary approach to economics, did argue that law, or at least property relations and ownership, played an important part in generating the institution of the leisure class, the elites, and their habits of thought. He argued that the emergence of the leisure class was a result of the shift from peaceful societies based on subsistence to what he regarded as the barbarian culture of capitalism, which coincides with the beginning of ownership. Quote. Veblen approached the price system from the perspective of anthropology. For him, it's culture, and notably the culture of conspicuous consumption and emulation, that drives the pecuniary behavior of elites in capitalism and thereby conditions the price mechanism. But ownership is regarded as critical to the origins of that cultural behavior. It is in the work of John R. Commons that we can find a focus not only on an engineered price system, but a price system and a market economy that is legally engineered. With his book, The Legal Foundations of Capitalism, Commons argued that Commons generated what Jeffrey Hodgson has described as, quote, a revelation in economics by proclaiming an institutionalist economics based on legal rights. In contrast to Veblen's emphasis on culture, Commons argued that it was the historically accumulated system of rights, duties, and obligations that conditioned individual action, as Tauhid has underlined. He highlighted a gap in neoclassical theorizing about prices, demonstrating that the transfer of titles is crucial and commodity exchange has to be understood as the interchange of legal rights. The legal foundations of capitalism is a shift then to conceive of human relations predominantly in terms of legal relations and transactions. More specifically, Commons considers legal relations as property relations and develops a widespread account of the structure of the political economy, thinking about things in terms of these legal relations. He carried out a detailed analysis of US legal history, seeking to understand the role that states and the courts played in creating the legal foundations for capitalism. Whereas for Veblen, it is the position in a social structure of employment relations, albeit employment relations that are generated in part through property structures that influence the actions of economic agents, for Commons, law plays a much more significant role. By means of generating rules and categories and institutions that progressively legalize social relations, law itself comes to operate as a structure that shapes and channels social agency. Commons introduced a dynamic account of legal change into his discussion, working up from the micro level of transactions between individuals to the macro level of government, showing that the origins of working rules reach longer into the past and their effects reach longer into the future, depending on where in this structure the rules are operating. This conceptualization of law as a social structure, as a system of entitlements that over time significantly enables and constrains particular kinds of behavior, is crucial to developing a legal theory of price. Two distinct legal institutionalist bodies of thought emerged from Commons' work. He inspired the approach of new institutional economists and economics, which is a field that recognizes some of the issues of the anti-institutionalism or the lack of institutions in the neoclassical account, but that nonetheless views the economy through the lens of transacting individuals. Commons took a largely favorable view of capitalism, and his reading of US legal history presents the courts as playing a key role in mitigating some of the less beneficial tendencies in capitalism, promoting an economy based on reasonable value, a term that is notoriously vague in his writings. Commons also inspired the work of legal realists. And if there was more time, it will be worth examining the contributions of the realists who theorized the economy and society by virtue of the functions of property rights and described the economy as a structure of coercive power arrangements. However, it is actually in the work of the last in the line of the old institutional economists, Warren Samuels, that I think we can find, for today at least, the clearest articulation of the significance of Commons with regard to thinking about price. For Samuels, the analysis of economic phenomena has to depart from the recognition that economic phenomena, prices, wealth, capital, risk, etc., are not natural phenomena or phenomena that respond to economic laws, be it those of supply and demand or the law of value in Marx, but are determined by the structure of rights that exist in society, and with the levels of and changes in these variables being in part a function of rights, and hence the legal structure and legal change over time. Significantly, as Mercuro and Medina underline, the question is not then one of more or less government, but rather whose interests government gives effect to through law, and more specifically, through the process of rights creation and recreation. The upshot of this analysis is that, quote, Mercuro and Medina, today's prevailing market prices of products and factors of production are all predicated on the past use of the state and past rent-seeking activities. So, As a result of this investigation into diverse schools of thought, we can see the foundations for developing a legal theory of price. There's still much to be worked out in terms of developing those insights into a workable theory or carrying out modeling work based on that analysis. But a few preliminary ideas can be outlined. A legal theory of price would reconceptualize prices away from being indexes of utility and scarcity, as they are in the dominant neoclassical tradition, towards indexes of the relative economic power that social actors are able to command as a result of their legal entitlements. It asks the question, which actors are being empowered by the state and its legal system to exercise economic power, and how does this impact on price formation? From this foundation, I contend, it is possible to develop a legal theory of price that can explain how prices are formed and behave. Others would doubtless dispute this contention, and I want to now reflect on a couple of key objections to my suggestion that this is possible. The first objection might be that it is the idea that it is possible to model prices based on an analysis of legal entitlements. Because, of course, while it can be helpful to identify different types of legal rights and how they confer price-making power on social agents, to argue that that creates a determinate effect that can be modeled accurately is a stretch, not least because, as generations of critical legal scholars have shown us, legal rights are subject to various interpretations, both by those that enforce them, the courts, the government, and by social actors that are using and relying on rights in their interactions. In reply to my argument, we can note that attempts have already been made and continue to be made to model the impacts of legal rights and entitlements on economic phenomena. The work of Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen on the role of entitlements, conceived more broadly, admittedly, in his analysis, on the causation of famines, was a modeling of how entitlement claims of different social groups resulted in different types of economic access, meaning that some sectors of society had plenty and others went hungry, even when food was not in scarce supply. Sen concluded that hunger and famine reflect legality with a vengeance. One way to approach the exercise would be to reverse engineer Sen, so as instead of trying to model how entitlements of different groups led to famine, to think about how the legal entitlements that produced prices that undermined economic access in the first place. Another approach is evident in the work of the regulation school theorists, who have analyzed the impacts of different accumulation regimes in influencing economic laws of capitalism as conceived by Marx. However, the larger point is that developing a legal theory of price does not mean excluding other variables, such as social networks, technologies, and path dependencies in analyzing prices. Nor does it involve an exclusive focus on property rights. Rather, it requires the more modest task of analytically prioritizing the role of law and legal entitlements in generating prices. It requires rethinking legal subfields like financial regulation, competition law, etc., in terms of how they create and recreate legal entitlements and distribute them to different social actors, generating economic power. Crucially, as we've seen, all the theories of price encountered so far are built on particular assumptions and emphasize some dynamics above others. A legal theory of price advances upon institutionalist approaches that have not developed a price theory by moving to the less empirically specific terrain of the dynamics of state-conferred legal entitlements. And while this involves making some simplifying assumptions, such a theory can nonetheless have as much explanatory power, I would argue, as the theories advanced by neoclassical economics and Marxist economics. What is more, the focus on state-backed legal entitlements has other advantages. I would imagine some critical scholars of law would argue that trying to develop a legal theory of price involves reifying the state, or even fetishizing the state as the engine of political economy. It would be rightly highlighted that the argument that state-backed legal entitlements generate prices black boxes the state and presents it as an intentional actor or an engineer, to use the phrasing of Hockett and Kreitner, that structures society mechanicalistically in pursuit of a specific agenda. Breivik has noted that Geoffrey Hodgson critiques Commons on similar grounds. Friedrich defends Commons against this charge, however, arguing that his notion of collective action in control of individual action is not to be equated with a hegemonic group of individual wills coercing many others into obedience. Instead, it acknowledges the weight of the past, which includes the slow evolution and sedimentation of rules on present action, as well as public and judicial opinion. This is social structure, she says, and not simply the state or government. A few further points must be made on this important observation. First, as Thiago Camarena Lopez argues in his masterful book, The Law of Value and Theories of Value, the choice of what a theory of value is supposed to measure is always a political intervention. Indeed, he argues that Marx's choice of labor as the basis for analysing value was the result of his commitment to the liberation of the working classes, and not necessarily because it was the only convincing way of conceptualising value. Choosing to advance the theory of price that analytically prioritizes the role of law and the state in assigning legal entitlements to social actors has emancipatory effects that defeat other objections that could be raised, this time by Marxists, against developing a legal theory of price. First, once we start to investigate the legal character of market prices and the medium that is used to measure those prices, money, we find the hands of government and the actions of legal officials all over prices and the creation of money, as the work of Christine Dezan, Jeremy Madoud, and others has demonstrated, in addition to the work of Hockett and Kreitner. Consequently, the engineered character of prices refutes the idea that there is no central planning. This planning is already taking place. Some Marxists might object that focusing on the role of law in producing prices leads us to fixate on price when we should be talking about value, about labor power. But talking about who has price-making power can lead us to think in terms of entitlements and property rights, meaning that a legal theory of price can serve the broader emancipatory purpose of denaturalizing the social relations of capital. As we saw in the survey of the conceptual terrain, property relations were seen to be generative of capitalism in many of these accounts, from conditioning Veblen's habits of thought to forming the basis of a social structure in commons. Another possible objection to trying to theorize prices by conceptualizing them as a function of legal entitlements assigned by the state is that this might not be a good emancipatory strategy if it doesn't describe accurately how the law generates prices. When we look from the vantage point of international law or transnational law, we see that states are immersed in a sea of law that, yes, they do create in formal terms, but that in practice constrains them and constrains their ability to challenge the valuations of private actors, particularly challenge private power and if it comes to altering the value, the economic value of assets. So in moving forward to develop a legal theory of price, we mustn't shy away from that complexity, and we must take into account also challenging issues, such as the relationship between colonialism, imperialism, and the power-conferring dynamics of legal entitlements, as well as considerations of race and gender. But a final point must be addressed. Legal scholars have thus far tended to adopt the Ungarian side of the debate about false necessity in law, stemming from the work of critical legal scholar Roberto Unger. Hockett and Kreitner argue that the theory of price and value in neoclassical economics involves assumptions that are, quote, yet more heroic in a world that is transparently of our own making and potential improving, as we elaborate more fully below. I would like to conclude by stressing that institutional contexts cannot be modified so easily. A legal theory of price must take seriously the sedimented and path-dependent dynamics raised by Friedrichs. This is not just the state, this is social structure. I would reply to Friedrichs, though, that the social structure is no longer conceptually distinguishable from law and the state. Earlier in the lecture, I referred to Marx's argument that there could be no just price, as prices represent the fragile contract that avoids the use of violence. And here I take Marx to be referring to the dynamic between labor and capital, the state as a mediating mechanism that offers just enough to workers to prevent them engaging in a violent overthrow of the system. But here Marx did not do adequate justice to the ways in which the fragile contract between labor and capital is maintained and mediated by a socially sedimented legal system that has been developed over time through numerous struggles conducted in legal forums, leading to new concepts and new techniques of enclosure and counterbalancing mechanisms that encourage continued engagement with the normativity of the system. Yochai Benkler and David Kennedy are two Harvard law professors who each offer a retelling, one of US legal history and one of the history of international economic law, to create dynamic accounts of the juridification of the social structure. If it is to have explanatory power, then, a legal theory of price must grapple with what Susan Marx has pointed to in her important work on false contingency. Indeed, while there is no mechanical economic law of value that moves actors around like pawns, irrespective of institutional contexts, the progressive juridification of the social structure, a development that encourages people to relate to one another as individual holders of rights and to claim dominion and sovereignty over things and over other peoples, means that political power is operating in a context constrained by something that looks and feels very much like a legally constituted law of economic value that makes departing from the norm of distributing the social surplus to property-owning elites a very challenging task. But it is not a task that we should stop struggling to accomplish. So thank you for being here and listening to the lecture. I have this slide which tries to break down the different perspectives, but I have no time left to talk about it in detail, but perhaps it could inform some questions. Thank you very much.